Okay, I just want to say good afternoon and welcome everyone to Colorado Livestock Association's third quarter safety program training. I'm Jane Lundvall and I'm stepping in for Brittany Dennison while on maternity leave, along with the rest of the CLA team, Jessica Lamel and Travis Grant. As a member, you'll receive 2 credit hours by completing both trainings this afternoon. And if you would please use the chat as a reminder, we need your name and policy name into the chat so we can award your credits. If you're a regular attendee and have questions, just enter those in the chat as well, and then we'll get those answered for you. If you can't complete both sessions today, we will offer one final training this year on November 20th for 2 final credit opportunities. And with that, thank you again for joining us today. I am excited to introduce you to Travis Grant, our new CEO. Travis?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is our third quarter safety training, and I am pleased to, for the first time, join you as the new CEO of the Colorado Livestock Association. So I just want to take a few quick moments before we kick off and just introduce myself and speak to a few of the things that we are doing here lately at the Livestock Association. So I am only about a month into the position, so I'm still getting my sea legs on me. I'm seeing a few names here in the participant list that I recognize, and I'm looking forward to getting to meet all of y'all over the next couple months as I get a little more settled. I come to the Livestock Association from Colorado Farm Bureau. I was managing our industry relations over there as well as doing some state and federal lobbying. So my background is in policy. Before that, I was in legislative offices at the state and federal level and also campaign electoral politics. I am born and raised in Elbert County. My wife and I actually just moved back there with our 18-month-old son. I've been around ag all my life, and so it's wonderful to be here at the Livestock Association and have the opportunity to continue advocating for this industry and for the communities that I've known all my life. So as for the work that we are doing here at CLA, some of the local, lately, some of the current events, we just sent the Vision magazine to publication. So it is being sent out to mailboxes, to your mailbox. If you haven't already received it, you should be receiving it soon, full of a bunch of great information about the work that was done last year, a letter from myself as well as from our president, Corey Kessinger, and I encourage everybody to flip through it and take a look. Additionally, we spent a fair bit of time, staff and leadership, for the association down at the state fair, including handing out awards at the junior livestock auction. And then politics never sleeps, never stops. So a lot of our work has been in that. We took a leading role in pushing back on the anti-meat climate campaign that came out of Denver. Unfortunately, we continue to see meat out type campaigns, and we will always push back on them. We were able to get that campaign shut down pretty quickly, largely due to the outpouring of opposition from the industry as well as from some of our partners like the National Western and the Denver Metro Chamber. So really grateful that Denver listened and pulled that. It's a shame that it ever even popped up. Last but not least, we had a special legislative session just a couple weeks back. We didn't expect to be too terribly engaged in that, but right in the 11th hour, a bill that affected the wolf reintroduction program was introduced. So we engaged on that. Initially, the bill was introduced with a pause in the text on any introduction efforts through the end of the fiscal year. That would be June 30th of next year. Ultimately, a compromise was put on that didn't pause the program, but did pause any use of taxpayer dollars. So we were at the table for that across the days of the legislative session. We were really taking the message of our producers need not be hurt by the passage of this, specifically in that we don't want to see any undue burden placed on our producers through retaliation on depredation claims being approved or being approved expediently. So we continue to carry that messaging to our legislators, and we will continue to represent you all at the Capitol and out in your communities whenever we can. So with that, I will turn it over to Libby. Today, Libby Bigler is our speaker, and we're grateful to have her. Libby works for Colorado State University's Department of Animal Sciences. She is the Colorado BQA coordinator. She is a graduate from CSU, graduated in 2011 with a Bachelor's of Science in Animal Sciences and a Bachelor of Arts in Journalism and Technical Communications. Prior to joining CSU, Biggie has worked with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association as well as the American Brahman Breeders Association. She's helped 2,500 Colorado cattle producers and employees earn and maintain their BQA certificates, which is an incredible number. Thank you, Libby, for that work. And she currently resides in Eaton, Colorado with her husband and 2 daughters. So thank you, Libby, for joining us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Absolutely. It's nice to meet you, Travis, virtually. I'll look forward to
Yes.
meeting you in person soon. And I'm also a fellow Elbert County native. So I'm like, we should have probably met up or known each other somewhere along the way. But nice to meet you. And thank you to the Colorado Livestock Association for asking me to present on some important safety topics that really do involve the Beef Quality Assurance Program. So I saw some of you all's names that are on the call. Many of you are supporters of BQA. Many of you are in my BQA certification database. So always appreciate you all earning your BQA certifications because it's the right thing to do. It's also a good way to market cattle and ensure that our consumers are trusting of our product out there. And it doesn't matter if you're a beef producer or a dairy producer, BQA is important. But today I've been asked to cover a couple of topics. I'll just try to share my screen now. That we hit on a lot in the beef quality assurance discussion. The first of which is understanding cattle behavior in order to improve your safety, your employees' safety, and also the safety and quality, safety of the animal, well, from a welfare concern or perspective, and the quality of the meat that we're producing. So I'm going to take that approach. And of course, for those of you that maybe don't know BQA, I wanted to introduce that to you first. Beef Quality Assurance is a program that is funded by the Beef Checkoff. So those of you that raise cattle do pay that $1 a head assessment into the Beef Checkoff. It is a voluntary program. Nobody's making you do it. And it is based on science-based research. There's an advisory group that meets twice a year that talks about guidelines that really will help influence meat quality, consumer confidence in the product, as well as cattle well-being. So with that in mind, this is the mission statement of the Beef Quality Assurance Program. That's the framework that I'm going to work under today when I talk to you about cattle handling, and then also as we get into vaccine handling and safety as we go throughout the afternoon. But the mission statement, I'll read it to you here. It's to guide producers towards continuous improvement using science-based production practices that assure cattle well-being, beef quality, and safety. And that term at the very end, safety, is really what we're focusing on today. I think a lot of times when folks think about safety in the context of BQA, as it is a 30-year-old program, we think about meat safety. But honestly, safety goes much farther than meat safety, and it goes into employee safety and animal safety. And so that's what we'll talk about as we go through this first slide deck. So why is safe and effective cattle handling important? There's a couple of big picture things here that we can look at. And the first of which is really promoting and enhancing that employee-employer relationship. You as employers, and some of you may be employees on the call as well, know that it is so important to have a workforce that is safe and healthy and properly trained, because when we have those pieces together, it demonstrates that the employee, the company, cares about the workers, and those workers then feel important and they are more productive and they have more of an understanding of their responsibility in their roles and to the cattle that are there. So it really is a relationship builder if we can provide this type of training to our employees. But also, I think one of the other important things that we always have to remember, and regardless of if you are a beef producer or a dairy producer, it really is all about consumer perceptions of our livestock industries. And that can be consumer perceptions based on how we raise cattle, based on how we treat employees. All of those things are key, and we need to have good training in that area. So, you know, the thing I always talk about is that consumers really want to know about things like food safety, how cattle were raised. They want to know about the integrity of the product that they're purchasing. And BQA is a way to tell that story, but also the components of BQA, the cattle handling, the welfare of those animals are a way to tell that story. You know, in the old days, people would buy beef because they liked how it tasted. They knew how to prepare it because they had family recipes passed down. And really, it came down to price. Now there are a lot of other pieces at play when we talk about consumer perception. And just to paint that picture a little bit more for you all, I use this in my BQA slides, but this just shows some consumer market research that the National Cattlemen's Beef Association has done. They did focus groups of beef consumers in high population areas across the country. So they went to each of the coasts, big cities on each coast, as well as I think Chicago, somewhere in that area. And they sat down with consumers and they asked consumers, okay, how many of you guys know how cattle were raised? And of that group, only 27% self-identified that they were familiar with how cattle were raised. So we can't verify that in any way. They just said, yeah, I know. We don't know if they've been to a feedlot or been to a dairy. We just know that they think they know, right? Then if you flip that around and you ask that same group of consumers, do you consider how your food was raised and grown when making a purchasing decision? That number jumps to 71%. So it just shows this huge disconnect between people who think or consider themselves an expert or can consider themselves as having some knowledge or understanding about how their food was raised versus those that really do care about it and will make a purchasing decision based on their understanding of that product in front of them at the point of sale. So we have to be able to do these trainings and do things right so that we can tell that story and help consumers want to continue to buy our products. So today I'm going to talk about a number of things, but in this little siphon funnel graphic that I share with you right now, there's a couple of things that I can't instill in you. First of all, I can't instill personal experience. So each of you on this call have your own personal experiences in raising and caring for livestock. And that is going to dictate some of what you do on a daily basis with your experiences and background in handling cattle. I also cannot give you your own professional judgment. You have to make good judgment calls every single day. And some of that does just take being in certain situations to understand what the best call from a professional standpoint is. But what I can share with you is that bottom pinkish part of the funnel. And I can share with you some knowledge, some understanding of cattle behavior so that you can link that to being safe and having positive outcomes for both yourself or your employees and the livestock in your care. So why are these things important? Well, let me show you a few of the reasons why we care about this, at least from the meat quality side, and let that trickle down into consumers caring about their product. So this first example, and I was told you guys can't interact necessarily except through chat, but so I'll go through these examples without asking you, hey, what do you think this is? But the first example, this is an example of a dark cutter. So on the left is the bright red, cherry red ribeye that we want to see that consumers will pick up in a meat case. On the right is that dark, firm, and dry, dark cutter ribeye. Dark cutters are caused by excess stress, long-term excess stress, and essentially what will happen is if you're a consumer in a fresh meat case, which one are you going to pick up and purchase? Right? The bright red one. And so consumers don't like that for a fresh meat case. And what's going to happen is that product will then be sent on to further processing, will reduce the value. It will become something like a roast beef where the color doesn't matter so much anymore. And it will, like I said, reduce the value. And not to mention, we're talking about animal welfare. If they're a dark cutter and they've went through extended periods of stress, enough to change the pH and the coloration of the muscle, then we're maybe not doing something right for that animal. Other reasons that animal handling are important. These are carcass bruises. Just to orient yourself to this, I don't know how many of you have been in a meat plant. So up here is where they hang the carcass by the hocks, right? And down here is the front leg, and this is where the head would be. So we're seeing some pretty severe bruising in the side, on the midline up here on the hip, and then this guy on the right is from the tail head all the way to about middle of the back. So handling can really influence bruising. What happens to these carcasses are those bruises have to be railed out on a different line. The bruises have to be trimmed out, and that decreases the sheer pounds of product. And in certain situations, right, some of these bruises are in areas where we have really high priced cuts of meat that really devalue the carcass. Not to mention bruises that severe are going to be painful, right? I have some bruises right now that I just, did something silly and tripped over the coffee table, and it's this big and it's pretty painful. Imagine those pretty severe bruises going in. And how can we eliminate those things? We'll talk about them today. But one of the things that we are seeing is that cattle are bought based on weights. Cattle are getting bigger and our facilities are staying the same size. So navigating those challenges are important. On a similar note, this is an example of what we would call a calloused ribeye. It does look like it's a bunch of fat filled in that ribeye, but it is callus material, callus tissue. What happens in these situations, and sorry for the low quality picture here, this is caused by severe trauma at a really young age for those animals. So, closer to slaughter, our bruises are going to look like this, that purple color, and different shades of purple and green and yellow depending on how healed it is. But this is what happens when a severe trauma happens in a calf and they grow up and they grow out of it, and that bruise material fills in with callus. So these can be hidden at a feedlot, and will have happened in calfhood. And then the last one that I want to share with you is kind of a big topic lately that we have to be aware of. And maybe those of you on this call that are at dairies or representing feeding operations maybe are rolling your eyes at me and saying, bird shot, we don't use shotguns to round up our cattle when we're in these kind of confined animal feeding operations. But I will tell you that through research, our National Beef Quality Audit, when we surveyed all of the slaughter cow and bull plants, 100% of them said they had issues with foreign materials like buck and birdshot. And when we surveyed the fed beef plants, the big ones that we have in Colorado would be JBS and Greeley and Cargill and Fort Morgan, 50% of those fed cattle plants said they have issues with buck and birdshot. So I'm kind of on I don't know if warpath is the right thing to say, but I'm kind of here to spread the word about the use and misuse of handling devices and that shotguns are not an approved handling device. And we see these issues. We also see issues with other foreign materials embedded like needles, as well as even darts. I don't know if any of you out there are using dart guns or remote delivery devices to deliver treatment, but those are out there too, and those are getting embedded in carcass. Okay. And let's not forget, I've said this several times, that it is our obligation to animal welfare, animal well-being, those animals that are in our care. So these are some of the reasons why it's important that we have this conversation and this discussion today. So I think this quote from some colleagues at Texas A&M University, their extension program, and one of these names you'll see on this quote, Dr. Ron Gill, is a BQA stockmanship clinician that will come out and often do live cattle handling demos. I took some of this material from him and some of his white papers, but this really sums it up, what I'm going to talk through today. He says the job of a stockman is to teach an animal to tolerate pressure and stress for short periods of time. So we're not trying to eliminate stress. We're not trying to not give or create pressure. We're trying to teach those animals to tolerate the pressure. Effective stockmanship skills are based on pressure and release. Animals will quickly learn to tolerate pressure and not develop stress if they perceive a way for pressure to be released. So we'll talk about that in the tips with cattle handling. So I always like to start giving you guys some thoughts about the principles of cattle behavior. And as I roll into this, the first thing that I want to share with you is the importance of understanding the best ways to communicate with cattle so that you can get good outcomes when handling them and stay safe. So there are three main ways we can communicate with cattle, and they're actually listed in priority from top to bottom on this slide. Priority meaning the ways that cattle prefer to be communicated with. So first and foremost is sight. Cattle preferred to be communicated with visually. So we need to do everything that we can to tell those cattle what we're asking them to do without making noise, without touching them, but visually. Putting yourself or your handling tool in an area that will get them to respond to your visual presence or your visual pressure. So always remember, sight is first. A secondary method that you can utilize is sound, but cattle are a lot like dogs, where different pitches and frequencies are, they hear them differently than people do. And so consequently, those sounds could potentially be stressful. They don't know where they're coming from. They kind of startle them. And so sound should be a secondary method when vision is not adequate, when you can't get into the field of vision in a way that will allow them to do what you're asking them to do. The other thing to know is that sound can also be, you can desensitize them to sound. So if you're flapping a flag over and over and over and over all day long when you're working cattle, that intended response that you're trying to get from the sound of the flag flapping isn't there because they just hear it the whole time they're going through the facility. So keep that in mind. And then the third way to communicate with cattle is touch. This is only useful in confined situations. So when you're working them through your working facilities, through your tub and your single file and up to your chute, not out in an alleyway, not out in a pen. And this isn't giving you permission to use electric prods as your handling device to touch cattle. Electric prods are a tool for emergency situations and they do their job, but they cannot be the primary handling aid. But this is when you've got cattle that are in a single file and they're not going and you're in a position where they can't see you. You might need to reach in and touch them in some way with a rattle paddle or a prod. The extent to which you touch them, how much force you touch them with, Dr. Temple Grandin will say, if you are hitting an animal with a rattle paddle or a prod, hard enough that if they were an Amazon cardboard box that you started crumpling the sides, that's too hard, if that makes sense. So keep in mind your pressure when you're using touch and what situations you're using it in. Okay, then I like to transition on to sharing with you the 5 principles of cattle behavior. So these are the 5 principles. Number 1 is that cattle want to see you, which we just talked about, right? That's the way they want to be communicated with, is visually. Secondarily, cattle want to go around you. Third, cattle want to be with and go with other cattle. Fourth is cattle want to return to where they have been. And fifth is that cattle can only process one main thought at a time. I have a slide for each of these, so I will describe them in more detail on the coming slides. So first of all, the first principle of cattle behavior is that cattle want to see you. This is related to the fact that that's how they like to be communicated with. And if you think about their vision, think about where their eyes are placed, right? They're on the side of their head, has to do with their natural instinct to be grazers. And so their range of vision is greater than 300 degrees all of the way around them. Because of that, they do have a blind spot right behind. So keep in mind, if you're trying to move cattle, do not get directly behind them. They're like a big semi-truck and trailer. They can't see right behind them. If you're right behind them, they're going to change their body positioning and move to where they can see you in their peripheral vision, and that changes the intended direction of flow of the cattle. They do have an area of binocular vision, meaning both eyes see directly in front of them between about 25 and 50 degrees, and I'll show you the graphic here in a second, but they see really well directly in front of them because they have both eyes able to focus. So you'll hear a lot of stockmanship clinicians talk about drawing the eye or working the animal from the front, and that's because they can see you with both eyes. Their peripheral vision is very wide, but it's not as precise around the sides of them. And then what about colors? I don't know anything specific about colors. We do have a colleague here at CSU, Dr. Lily Edwards-Callaway, who has a great presentation about the structures in the eye for livestock and the cones and rods and those kind of things. What I can tell you, though, is that cattle prefer to go from areas of dark to light. So if you're trying to go the opposite, from really bright outside to a dark building or a shed or shade, that's going to be more, or a trailer, that's going to be more challenging to get them to go from light to dark than it would be from the trailer to unload out into a light open area. The other thing that's challenging with cattle is the way that they perceive shadows. They don't have very good depth perception, and so shadows look like deep, dark, scary holes that they tend to want to jump over. So if we can eliminate shadows as distractions when we're working cattle, we'll be in better shape. I also mentioned on here hearing, just one of their senses, and I already talked to you a little bit about this. They can't determine the source of sounds as well as humans. Loud noises might startle them, and they do have a wider range of hearing, so be very particular and precise with how you use sound when you're working with cattle. So this is that little graphic I wanted to show you. So you can see in green up front, this is that binocular vision. That it says field of vision, but that's where they can see really well and they can perceive things really well directly in front of them. They see greater than 300 degrees around and they have a blind spot right behind. So we want to make sure you stay out of that blind spot. Typically trying to get an animal to go forward is working off of them at like a 45-degree angle and stepping into what we call a flight zone. So leading into that, this is why kind of cattle want to go around you. They are built in with this natural pressure zone that we would call a flight zone. And essentially, cattle have this personal bubble, and it varies depending on the individual animal. And so, how close can you get to that animal before they want to relieve pressure? That's their flight zone. This is related to their desire to want to maintain visual contact. And so, a really good tip here is that cattle handlers should position themselves so that when cattle go around them, they're pointed at the intended destination, considering their flight zone, right? So, that edge of flight zone. You can have a flight zone for an individual animal. You can also have a flight zone for a group of animals. Sometimes flight zone can be challenging with groups of animals, and that's why we suggest, and I think I talk about this later on, moving animals in small groups because the amount of pressure and flight zone on a big group that you have to put on the rear of the animal is much greater than the amount of pressure on the animals in the front of that group, if that makes sense. So smaller groups are better. The other thing that we'll talk about on this chart is the point of balance. A point of balance on an animal is somewhere around their shoulder, and it helps a handler either keep cattle moving forward, or slow them down or stop them, depending on where you're positioned, or if you're in front of the point of balance, turn them around and go backwards. So if I step into the flight zone behind the point of balance, this animal is going to want to keep going forward. If I step into the flight zone in front of the point of balance, she's in a single file right here. She's going to stop. She has nowhere to go and her stress level is increased. But if she wasn't in that red single file chute, she'd want to turn back around and go the other way. And if you're walking with the animal and you stay right around that point of balance, they're going to slow down and stop with you. You need to kind of position yourself on either side to get them to continue to go one way or the other. Using the point of balance is also really helpful in a single file. This is a diagram that I pulled from Dr. Temple Grandin. You can see these animals are all in a single file lead up. If you get these cattle and they're kind of stuck right there, the idea is to move in triangles, in straight lines, are walking back by the point of balance. Moving, sparking that motion from in front, you're standing right here, she's going to want to stop. And if you trigger that movement and go behind the point of balance, it should trigger them to continue forward all the way down the line. When that first one goes, due to their herding instinct, they should follow up. And so in this situation, you are using your physical presence as a visual trigger to spark that motion, understanding their point of balance. But always keep in mind that when you have cattle in this single file, just because they're restrained into a straight line doesn't mean that they no longer have a flight zone. So sometimes when you have cattle in a single file like this and you're just hanging out around here, you're increasing stress on them because you are putting pressure within their flight zone and they can't relieve the pressure by getting away. So only moving up close to those single file lead ups when necessary to trigger the motion to get cattle to go is something to keep in mind. Okay, the third principle of cattle behavior is that cattle want to be with and will go with other cattle. We know this because they are a herd animal. They have herd instincts. They're also a prey species. So one of the things that I mentioned on the last slide was moving in straight lines. The reason that we suggest moving in straight lines in and away from a point of pressure is because arched patterns are reflective of predators, and that will increase stress. So straight lines and triangles and working from the front of cattle really helps. This diagram that I put in here is to basically tell you that, if you're a cattle handler and you're going to go pull a whole pen of cattle, a lot of times people get it in their head that they're just going to march into that pen, going to walk straight to the back of the pen and just going to push them right out, right? And if you start there with that mindset, you are not taking advantage of the fact that you can work them from the front. So the moment you open that gate, you can use drawing pressure with both eyes on that animal, the first animal at least, the lead animal, to kind of draw them towards you. And the whole time you're moving through the pen, you're getting the other cattle to use their herd instinct to draw themselves from that pen. We also talk about this handler movement pattern. So I told you, move in straight lines. Don't do arch patterns because they're reflective of predator species. But some of you are looking at this slide going, wait a minute, it's saying going back and forth behind these cattle. And what kind of animals go back and forth behind the cattle? Those of you that use dogs on your operations know that your border collies do that, right? But if we keep a straight line and not an arch, it's going to do the same thing. without adding that added stress. You're going to be in the peripheral of this side of the cattle, and then you're going to be in the peripheral of this side once you get behind those animals. But really let them do the work as herd animals when you're moving them in small groups, right? And you're not putting too much pressure on the rear animals while too little pressure on the front. The next principle of cattle behavior is cattle want to return to where they have been. Or another way to think about this is that cattle want to return to the last place where they felt the least amount of pressure, their last safe space. So if you look at these photos that I have on this slide, this one where Dr. Grandin is drawing her serpentine tub system, these cattle back here in those pens before they went in the serpentine, they didn't feel much pressure back there, right? They're just hanging out. Once you get handlers in there and start moving them into the handling facilities, we have more pressure on them. But as we snake back towards the area where they feel less pressure, it kind of relieves the stress. They think they're going back to where they have been, and we recapture them in the tub and then start loading them up into the single file. So really, we capitalize on that instinct of going to the last place where there wasn't much pressure. If you use a bud box, like on the left side, this little graphic that's going, same idea, right? We're putting pressure on them, bringing them into a box, but once they hit that end gate, they turn around and they feel like they're going back to where you just brought them from. You just close that gate and then redirect them up a single file. So I think this is a really useful thing to understand. Also, if you're doing health checks and you're writing pins and you're trying to get an individual animal out of a pen, that's really challenging, right? Because that's where that home pen is where they feel the least amount of pressure. If you can grab 3 of them because they're a herd animal, bring them out into the alley, sort off the one sick one, those other 2 will go back pretty easily to their last safe place because they want to return to where they have been. Okay? And then the last principle of cattle behavior is that cattle can only process about one main thought at a time. So if cattle are thinking about anything other than what you're asking them to do, you got to change their focus before you put pressure on them. So really what I'm saying here is you need to eliminate any and all distractions so that their only thought is there's a handler here, they're putting pressure on me to do whatever it is, and that's their own main thoughts. Examples might be, if you're loading a group of cattle into a trailer, and that trailer is a dark little hole, right? They don't like to go from light to dark, and you've got 4 or 5 of them. And so their brain is going, ooh, that's dark. I don't think I should go in there. That's one thought. And then what about you're in the back and they've stopped moving, and so you start yelling and hollering and whistling. Then that thought goes from, should I step into this scary dark hole, to what the heck is the ruckus on behind me? And you're going to create some challenges because you have that distraction. Other novel items, something flapping, something on the rail, dogs, kids, vehicles, reflections, all of those things should be assessed so that when you're asking cattle to go through a facility, they're not seeing a bright reflection or they're not seeing a shadow and that distracting them from the one main thought of going through these. So the last things that I want to talk about are actual pointers and tips to help improve both your safety and animal safety as we're working with cattle. So these are the areas that I will talk through. Handler speed. We already talked a little bit about working cattle from the front, but hopefully I'll give you some more whys and hows. Some tips on applying pressure, going with and against the flow of cattle. And we already talked about this a little bit, moving in triangles, but also getting cattle ready to work and whose job that is and how that plays into safety. So first of all, handler speed. Do you guys ever hear people say, or I say it every time I do a BQA training, the fastest way to work cattle is slow, right? It's not about how many head I got processed in those 2 hours. It's about how safely and effectively we got the job done. And in doing that, we have to remember that speed is not necessarily key. And so that middle bullet point there says slow down so you can be fast. Movement is created. You have to create movement, and then you have to position yourself correctly to make sure that that movement works. When you lose the movement of cattle, those cattle kind of become reluctant. So everything that we're talking about here on those principles of cattle behavior is triggering movement and then maintaining the movement using pressure and release. And so that doesn't necessarily mean going fast. That means being deliberate about what movements you're creating and where you are putting pressure on those cattle. A lot of times, if you are in a hurry, you're not being deliberate and you're not thinking about the next thing that you're going to be asking the cattle to do. And consequently, you put too much pressure on the animal or you pressure them incorrectly, and then you'll get an unintended negative reaction from those animals. And then you have to actually fix that before you keep going. So being really thoughtful and deliberate about what you're doing, making sure that cattle have a place to go before you apply pressure, which I think is on another slide. Here's the plan of attack, and everybody knowing the plan of attack if they're the ones helping you to bring cattle where they need to go. So keep that in mind. Sometimes when you get going too fast, you're not thinking, and then you put the wrong kind of pressure or too much pressure on. And then if you don't fix that, then you're in a big wreck moving forward the rest of the day. I already also talked about this, working cattle from the front, right? They can see you well with both eyes right in front, and they want to see you. So if you can capitalize on that, you should be in pretty good shape. The other thing to know is that if cattle are not afraid of humans, you can maintain their focus on the intended direction of movement better if you are in front of them because they can see you with both eyes, right? Working cattle from the front is very key to working cattle in confinement. Pushing them out, I showed you that picture where I said you just march into the pen and you think you're going to go to the back and just push them on out. That can be difficult. That can be stressful. And so if you can draw their attention from the front and you can funnel them out of pens in confinement, that's going to be really helpful. So draw them towards the gator opening and they can flow into the alleyway. And then working them from the side as they're coming at you is a really good way to kind of almost train those cattle to not be afraid of humans. So, you also should remember that we should anticipate what those cattle are going to want to do once you get into their flight zone, and read the boundaries of their flight zone. And they'll have a flight zone from the front as well. But what will happen is when you get in there, you add too much pressure from the front, they're going to turn around and run the other direction. So keep those things in mind and remember that working cattle from the front, flowing them into the alleyway, and using both eyes where they have the best visual discretion and distinction is a really good way to have them do what you're asking them to do, but also stay safe when you're working cattle. The next one I want to talk about is applying pressure appropriately. So what you're trying to do here is work to keep cattle comfortable to go by you and remain on a straight path. If you work cattle from the front, it means they need to be comfortable going by you without freaking out. If you're in an alleyway and you need them to go past you, you don't want them to spook, you don't want them to jump, you don't want them to hesitate, you don't want them to kick. That and applying pressure correctly from the front again facilitates, pinning, sorting, processing cattle. I think I've said this a couple of times, but remember, you only want to apply pressure to cattle when they have a place to go and they know that that's where you want them to go. So you want to set them up to when you apply pressure to those animals, they know where they're going, but set them up before, right? Get yourself positioned before you apply the pressure so they know where they're going. And then they're just kind of like dogs. I always think of this. I took my dog to the PetSmart dog training and it's always about positive reinforcement, right? If your dog sits, you give them a treat and then they'll continue to sit because you gave them a treat. Releasing pressure right when the result is achieved, you've set them up to go a certain way, you give them the pressure, they went the way that you wanted them to go, and then removing the pressure, meaning you back off and you remove the pressure, that's the reward for that animal in that case. And that's going to set you up for success in the future. And then as we talked about, there's a blind spot on these animals. So make sure that you only pressure them from behind when absolutely necessary. Remember your zigzag patterns. Remember to pull smaller groups. And if you can side pressure them along with drawing the pressure from the front, that will keep you out of the blind spot just innately. Going with and against the flow, I talked through this already, but it all deals with the point of balance. So if you are working with cattle, if you're walking alongside cattle, as you approach their point of balance, going with the flow of them, they're going to slow down or stop, okay? If you stay behind and add pressure, they'll continue going forward. But as you approach that point of balance, they'll slow down or stop. If you're going the opposite direction of cattle and you pass from the front of the point of balance to the back, just like we saw in Dr. Grandin's chart, which is actually on the next slide again to reiterate the point, it will initiate or accelerate their movement, make them go faster if you're going against the flow. If you're going with the flow, they'll slow down or stop. Against the flow, they speed up. We talked about this. The triangles, arch patterns are reflective of predators, so work straight lines to avoid cattle going into that fight or flight response. Move straight towards a point on an animal to get the response. Once you get the desired response, remember to remove the pressure, but remove it in a straight line away from the animal at an angle away from the movement. So always do straight lines or triangles in and out of the flight zone. And then the last thing that I think is really interesting, and maybe oftentimes for this crowd, potentially, if you're running confined feeding operations or dairies, this can be challenging because maybe not at a dairy, but if you're a feedlot and you're receiving cattle that you don't know how they were started at their primary place of, the ranch or whatever, you could have some challenges here. But really, cattle work the best when they're ready, and somebody has to get them ready to work well and work in a safe manner to where they are not in fight or flight mode or stressing out or being in a dangerous situation. So cattle themselves are taught and conditioned and prepared to work. So somebody has to do that. And really, it's a cattle handler's job to do that, but can be challenging in particular situations. Shouting, whistling, poking, prodding, all of those kinds of distractions are counterproductive. That's not going to condition or prepare them to work well. That's going to condition or prepare them to react or respond. And remember, bad, unruly behavior in cattle and people is learned. So you've learned it some way, and that's how you learn to respond to those kinds of pressures and situations. So don't distract cattle from intended movements, and know that when these cattle are prepared to work well or work through a certain type of facility or work with someone on foot versus on horseback or vice versa, it's going to improve your worker safety if they've been conditioned to understand and know what's being asked of them in these situations. And like I said, can be problematic depending on where cattle are sourced, but know that that should be the ultimate goal. And honestly, if you're buying cattle from a particular ranch and you know that their cattle handling is better for your feedlot employees, right? That's something that I feel like should be a value add to that producer. I also wanted to add a few more slides on how do we know we're doing a good job. Beef Quality Assurance and other different audits around the country have come up with metrics to measure cattle handling through a working facility, at least on beef cattle. I don't know what these metrics would look like for dairy cattle, but we want to make sure that when you're handling cattle through a chute, you are beneath these percentage thresholds on 100 cattle going through a squeeze chute. So we want you to use an electric prod less than 10% of the time. Miscatches that are not readjusted, there's zero tolerance for. So if you miscatch something and you still continue to do a procedure on that animal, we have zero tolerance for that. If you miscatch it and you let them go and rework them, or you're able to readjust, that's fine. But miscatching, belly catching, hip catching, and still doing a procedure is zero tolerance. We want cattle to vocalize in the chute before the procedure, less than 5% of the time. If it is due to a procedure, that's okay, right? Of course, you're going to bellow if you get a needle in the neck. But if it's before the procedure, we want it to be less than 5% of the time. We want less than 25% of cattle to run or jump exiting the chute. We want less than 10% of cattle to stumble coming out of the chute, meaning going down on one knee. And we want less than 2% of cattle coming out of the chute to actually fall and go down all the way to their belly. And so if you're above those thresholds, if you ever do this as an assessment, a self-assessment, and you're above those thresholds, keep in mind, maybe there's something that we can do to improve this, whether it's our facilities or how we're handling cattle. I also want you to keep in mind some special considerations for facilities. Facilities are not going to fix handling problems. You may invest in the top of the line facilities, but if you have not focused on effective cattle handling, you're not really going to get anywhere. It's not a silver bullet. It's going to be helpful, but it all starts with the mentality of handling cattle in a safe way. However, there are some things that we always want to keep in mind that are important for facilities to make sure that cattle have the best outcomes. So first of all, flooring is important. We need to have grooved or deep textured concrete to give cattle enough traction. Rubber flooring or rubber tire mats or these animats we're using a lot now in areas where there are high traffic or cows stand for a long period of time. So holding areas, maternity areas, in front of the chute, in the single file lead up, all of those are important. We also want to be careful about anywhere that creates an electric current. Crowd gates, fences, stall trainers, any of those things are very important to understand how they function and make sure that we don't have unnecessary contact with that electrical current. So inspecting those regularly are very important. Lighting is key, right? They like to go from areas of dark to light. So having as much good solid lighting as we can will help reduce stress for these animals when we're handling them. And then also consider air quality. We need good ventilation to reduce dust, odors, other noxious gases, and things like that. Some other special considerations when handling cattle would be when we're transporting them, that's going to provide excessive stress on the animal. And if we have cattle that are compromised or debilitated, they become non-ambulatory, they become downers. There are some special situations that we need to think about for those animals, not the same exact handling safety requirements apply. So just know that we want to keep, inspecting our trailers for transport. We're following loading capacities and densities, and we're considering weather when we're transporting those cattle. And then if we've got downers, never use an electric prod on them. Don't use chains to suspend and dangle those animals. If they are in a home pen, don't leave them in a situation where they might get trampled on because the feed truck comes by and they're right up next to the bunk or something like that. And don't attempt to move really severely weak animals to processing or to shipping or to the parlor. The other thing that, from a safety perspective, is important is that we are obligated to provide humane euthanasia to animals that are in need of it. And so doing that in a way that's safe for the animal and safe for the person is key. A lot of times on these operations, the best, most practical way is to use a firearm. Aiming is very important. So hitting that brain in one single shot and then staying safe while you're ensuring confirmation of death, right? You need to wait probably 5 minutes so that those animals settle, their bodies settle. But knowing, lack of heartbeat, lack of respiration, lack of corneal reflex. But honestly, there should only be 1 or 2 trained employees that can do euthanasia, and the tools for euthanasia should be kept under lock and key at all times until the moment of needing them for use. So I've gone over a little bit, but this is the take-home message part for the handling component of our safety meeting today. All of these things are going to be improved, welfare, performance, and even people's quality of life as we consider best practices for handling cattle. So, of course, from a welfare perspective, we're going to improve our public perception of our industry. We should have less injury to livestock and handlers by following these guidelines. And then ultimately, from a BQA side of things, less carcass damage. At the same time, if we're doing things well from a management side of things and handling cattle correctly, we're going to increase their efficiency, increase their gain without additional inputs. We're going to spend less money on medicine and treatments and facilities, and that's going to be an economic incentive for us. And then as far as quality of life goes, right, all of these things should increase our profitability. It's going to be sustainable for our family operations. And of course, we'll have some enjoyment of our lifestyles.
Thank you, Libby. I just wanted to mention another great animal handling and safety resource is available on our website. We were granted some money from High Plains Intermountain Center for Agricultural Health and Safety. And the video features Dr. Dean Fish, stockmanship clinician from Santa Fe Ranch in Arizona, and our own Libby Bigler from BQA, of course. It's available in English and Spanish, and you can find it in our safety section at the bottom. Scroll through and feel free to share that, but it's all of this great information that Libby just shared. And I think it'd be a great tool for you for managers and workers.
Thanks, Jane. I'm very remiss to not mention that. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Fine.
We worked hard on that a few years ago, and it turned out to be a really excellent resource that if you all want to take it back and use it for employee training, it has all of those same content, a lot of the same content that I just shared. And Dean also does it in Spanish. So if you have the need for Spanish training, that would be another really good option for you through Colorado Livestock and that grant from HICUS. So yes, thanks for remembering that, Jane. Okay. if there's no questions on this, I will try to get through this next part of my presentation and get you guys all back outside to our beautiful September afternoon, not staring at the computer screen. So the second component that I was asked to talk about today was vaccine safety and handling. And I'm going to take it from a beef quality assurance approach, but also going to talk with you a little bit about some human safety components. And so there are a few slides that I have been that I've taken here from our CSU Extension veterinarian, Dr. Kathy Whitman. She's such a great resource from a veterinary perspective. So if you ever have questions, specific questions on livestock, or she was a beef cattle specialist, practicing specialist before she came with CSU. She's a great resource. And then I also pulled some from slides from our past owner of Mountain Vet Supply, Bill DeMoss. I think he's a CLA member. So we got some great resources to cover here. So of course, we have the responsibility of working to keep our cattle healthy. This is a big component of beef quality assurance. And one of the things that I think is very unique and important in our industry is the ability that we have as producers to be able to provide some of these technologies ourselves. Physically, we give these shots, right? We put into place a vaccine protocol to keep our cattle healthy. And I think that's important that we have the ability to continue to do that. And we don't have to go through a veterinarian for someone else or a vet tech or something like that to do these everyday processes that make our lives easier and that help benefit the welfare of cattle. So there are some innate things that could be dangerous when we're talking about vaccine safety and handling. And so I'm going to cover those things, but also I'm going to cover some of the things that we should consider to make sure that the tools that we have available to us work the best that they can. So where I'm going to start this conversation is obviously this is a key component to beef quality assurance. We're going to talk about herd health and disease prevention, but the biggest component that we have to start with every time is the importance of having a VCPR, or a veterinary client-patient relationship. I feel like I talk about this over and over and over again, but it is very important for us as livestock producers to have a working relationship with a veterinarian so that they can do a number of things for us. Some of those things are like, let's work with them so that they can assess the risk factors in our herd and help us develop herd health plans. Let's work with them so that they can help us design and implement a preconditioning protocol or a vaccine program. Because a lot of times in cattle production, there's some history surrounding like some legacy there, right? Like my grandparents have had this ranch forever and they vaccinated for XYZ, and that's all you've ever done because it was kind of passed down. This was what we do every time that we, bring cattle in. But that doesn't mean that things haven't changed or that your risk factors haven't changed or that, there's other diseases to be aware of to limit the spread of or things like that. And a veterinarian can really help us with that. They also can prescribe medications to us. They can also issue certificates of veterinary inspection and other health certificates. Also, veterinarians are required, if you're going to use any product differently than what the FDA approved label indicates, you shouldn't do that as a practice. We should always abide by the label. But if there are certain situations where we have to use extra label drug use, we need to have a veterinarian's approval and we need to keep good records on those things. So just to hammer it down a little bit closer and hone in, what do we need or when should we utilize a vet? We should utilize this veterinarian under a VCPR for consulting and establishing a herd health plan so they can develop breeding and vaccination protocols. They can help assess nutrition, and they can establish these preconditioning programs. Vets are also useful for annual breeding exams, pregnancy diagnosis, other herd checks. They can help assess biosecurity. And if you have an outbreak, we can investigate outbreaks as veterinarians. They can help you design good record-keeping programs, help you go through self-assessments like what I just talked about in the cattle handling self-assessments. We've got other types of self-assessments to keep you continually improving from a herd health perspective. They'll establish treatment and deworming protocols for you. And then, of course, if you have an emergency, that's another time that is very important to utilize a veterinarian. I'm going to touch a little bit more on kind of the herd health planning concept and where vaccination specifically plays in there. So as you're developing a herd health plan, work with those veterinarians to determine your risk of infection or infectious or metabolic or toxic diseases. work with them to develop management programs that fit the herd health's needs. And you may or may not be aware of your herd health needs. And so that's an important component here, is to work with them to identify those needs. I have bolded and underlined, review and revise this at least annually. I would imagine that if I was in a room with you all and I asked, do you do this annually? I would hope many hands would come up, but depending on where you sit in the industry supply chain, I feel like sometimes, or even geographically where you're located, we've got rural veterinary shortages, and maybe annually hasn't happened for a few years, but annually is kind of what we recommend. And then we should always do a risk assessment and consider the efficacy of the available products that are out there to make sure that we're using what works appropriately in our different production segment. So why do we need to do this? Why do we actually need to have something called a herd health plan? You know, we do a lot of herd health things, but have a written plan in place. Well, first and foremost, cattle are susceptible to diseases. We know that. We want to keep disease at risk low, right? But they are susceptible to diseases just like you and I. We also know that healthy herds are more productive. So if we can keep cattle healthy, we're going to be more productive, and that and prevention and early intervention will reduce economic losses. So those couple of things on the why there make me think back to my little diagram at the end of the closing of cattle handling, right? We want to be productive. We want to have, economic value, and we want to be sustainable for the future. So that's the why we need a herd health plan. And where does vaccination play into that? So here's a comprehensive herd health. This is understanding comprehensive herd health. I put this slide together and I'm actually really proud of this slide. I use it in the class that I teach at CSU on quality assurance. And I really like my Venn diagram here on the right. Disease prevention, and we're going to talk about disease prevention in the framework of vaccinations as we get to it, but it's really where management and medicine cross paths here, right in the middle. So we know that vaccination is a tool, but it's not a cure-all, and we need to make sure that that tool is useful to us and we're using it in a manner that's safe for both the livestock and for the people administering the vaccines. But just know, you can't just vaccinate. We have to have good management in there as well. And management includes nutrition, handling, facilities, all of the biosecurity, all of those things. So, if you look at those bullets, 3 major factors to keep disease losses to a minimum. One is prevent exposure to the disease. So that could be a number of things. Vaccination could play a role in there, but preventing exposure, keeping disease resistance high. We need our cattle to be able to resist diseases. That can include vaccination, right? If they've seen it, their immune system has responded to it, they're going to be more resistant when they do come across that disease. But nutrition, management, housing, handling is all part of that picture as well. And then lastly, if disease does occur, we want to prevent it from spreading on our operations. That could be segregation, that could be treatment. But if we do have a good vaccine program in place, hopefully we've got a good population of cattle that have built some immunity to diseases that may come across. So like I said, it's not a cure-all. We have to have good foundational management in a number of areas, but it is a really good tool to help us. Having that VCPR is key to figuring out where and how we prevent diseases and how vaccines and vaccinations can be a tool for us. This is a slide from BQA, but this is kind of targeting the medicine side of that Venn diagram, not management, but medicine, right? Different types of products that we can use in a comprehensive herd health plan from a medicine perspective. So we can use over-the-counter products. Most of those vaccines are over-the-counter products. We can use prescription products. Those are often going to be our antibiotics. All injectable antibiotics require prescription through a veterinarian under a valid VCPR. And those are what we're going to use in a situation where we do have disease that occurs, as long as it's a bacterial disease. And then I already mentioned this, if there's any reason why we need to use any of those 2 types of products, over-the-counter or prescription, differently than what's on the FDA-approved label, that requires a VCPR, a veterinarian's approval. It can change how those products work, but it may be kind of a last resort situation where the vet says, this is all we can do in this situation. We're going to use it extra labelly. They'll sign off on it, and then that helps put some accountability on the animal health professional going forward. Keeping good records of that is key. So, and that's what this little fly-in is indicating. So on the medicine side, I already talked about this, but we have vaccinations and we have antibiotics. Vaccines are for prevention, antibiotics are for treatment. And so I was asked specifically to talk about vaccine handling and safety. And so that's what we're going to cover off on the rest of the day. Those substances that are injected into a person or an animal to protect against a particular disease, those can be protecting against viral diseases as well as bacterial infections, where those antibiotics on the other side, those can only cure bacteria. You can't use an antibiotic on a virus, which actually kids stayed home this week with a viral infection. I almost wished it was strep so I could give them an antibiotic and take care of the sickness, but nope, that virus has to run its course. So if we can use vaccines up front and hopefully do a good job of administering them safely and effectively, we'll probably have better outcomes down the road to where we don't have to bring cattle in or treat them or let a virus run its course. One of the principles of vaccination is something we call herd immunity. Herd immunity refers to the resistance to the spread of contagious disease within a population that results if a sufficiently high proportion of individuals are immune to the disease, especially through vaccination. So I think hopefully you guys can see this as it's rolling through. This is kind of a visual of how this herd immunity works and really what we're trying to get at by vaccinating our calves or our cow herd or whatever group of livestock that we are trying to prevent disease in. Let me see if I can go back again and start it over. Let's see. So you can see how, if none of them are vaccinated, they all turn red. Everybody gets sick. If 50% are vaccinated, 50% of them-ish get sick. And if 95% are vaccinated in the bottom right, there's only a couple in there that end up getting infected. Vaccines are not 100%. Not all cattle immune systems are created equally, and not all environments that they're coming from or times that you're vaccinating are ideal. And so, although it's not 100%, it is going to do a pretty darn good job of keeping disease risk at bay if we do it appropriately. But the goal is this kind of herd immunity concept. So these vaccines aid in prevention of common viral and bacterial disease and lessen the possible need for treatments. And a good important note here is residue risk later in the production cycle. If we have a bunch of cattle get sick, let's say we only vaccinate 25%, that top middle, and we're at a feedlot and we're pulling all of those black dots, right, that spread one to another, and we're having to treat them with an antibiotic. We're treating and treating and treating. Hopefully we're keeping really good records, but if you have it's more likely that some of those will slip through and have antibiotic residues in their carcasses when they get to packing. Where if we're down here at the 95% vaccinated and we've got 2 or 3 to pull, it's a little bit easier to keep good records and make sure we're not shipping cattle that have antibiotic residues in their systems. So that's kind of the goal, is herd immunity. So let's talk about understanding the different types of vaccines that we use in cattle production. As I mentioned, they're a prevention tool. They're not 100%, and you have to have good management practices to make sure that they work the best way possible. And those management practices are both on the cattle and on how we handle the vaccines themselves. So a couple of main types of vaccines that we talk about are the modified live vaccines and killed vaccines. From a high-level perspective, a modified live vaccine, that vaccine contains a live pathogen for the target disease that we're trying to create some immunity against, but that live pathogen has been altered to reduce its ability to cause the disease. So you are injecting a live pathogen into the animal. The animal recognizes that through its immune system and says, okay, I know what this is now. When I see it in the wild, I'm going to know how to respond to it and not allow the body to get sick. So it is a live pathogen, it just won't cause the disease. A killed vaccine, on the other hand, the pathogen for the target disease is in the vaccine, but it is no longer living. That's why it's called killed. And so it is a little bit more challenging for the immune system to respond to something in it that is no longer living. And so the way that these vaccines are put together typically have some adjuvants in there that kind of stir up the immune system and say, hey, look at this thing. This could come at you in a live form, and we need the body to respond to it. So there's some differences in how we handle these two to make sure that they work appropriately. And there's some differences in how these two different types of vaccines could actually have negative health risks for humans. So let's talk specifically about modified live vaccines. Modified live and chemically altered products must be reconstituted with a sterile diluent prior to being used. So how they come is in a box here, right? With two different bottles. One has just a sterile diluent in it. The other has this freeze-dried powdered cake. You have to reconstitute it in order to activate the pathogen that is living in it to be able to inject it into the animal to get the immune response. One of the reasons that it is living is the immune response requires the pathogen in that vaccine to replicate inside of the animal. Cannot replicate if it's dead. It can only replicate if it's living. So it has to replicate within the body to create the immune response. So because of that, on these modified live vaccines, you don't have much time to use them. You need to reconstitute them, use them within about a 2-hour window. So don't mix everything in the morning if you have a 8-hour day of vaccinating. So mix as you go to make sure they work correctly. And then the other important thing is that these vaccines really, really, really don't respond well to UV light, ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light are probably the #1 killer of the pathogen in there. So if we want that pathogen to be living, we need to be extra careful that we are using it in a way that we're not overexposing it to ultraviolet light. The other thing that we should be aware of is that we don't ever want to vigorously shake them once we've reconstituted them. Some of the old product labels will say that. It'll say shake vigorously. But what happens if you shake them too hard? It's a living pathogen. You're going to denature the pathogen to where they are not effective anymore, or you could have some other negative outcomes there. So keep those things in mind. Most vaccines need to be stored between 35 and 45 degrees. So temperature is key, but a little too hot for a little too long is probably better than a freeze and then a thaw, which I'll get to in a sec. The next slide is actually, I don't know if I put volume on this, but this is Dr. Julia Herman mixing a vaccine.
It is important to use a sterile transfer needle when reconstituting modified live or chemically altered vaccines. Most commonly, you will place the transfer needle in the stopper of the diluent bottle first. Then invert the needle and diluent bottle as you place the other end of the transfer needle in the stopper of the vial containing the desiccated vaccine cake. This allows the vacuum to draw the diluent into the second vial. When using a transfer needle, always follow product label instructions. Transfer needles ensure against product contamination during mixing.
Can somebody give me the thumbs up, or Jess, did you guys hear that, or should I re-talk through it?
It worked great.
Okay, perfect. So just know that there is a reverse vacuum on there. So if you're going to use a transfer needle, you have to stick it into the diluent side first, because otherwise you will remove the vacuum and then it won't suck through. You also notice that Dr. Herman mixed by kind of going like this. You could also swirl around, and that's another way that you can mix it without denaturing the product. I think the most important point on there is if you're using a transfer needle, you're going to reduce the likelihood of contamination of the vaccine and keep it sterile as you're using that transfer, rather than drawing it up in one syringe and reconstituting it with the same needle into that other bottle. So that's how we have to manage modified lives. Killed vaccines usually are suspended in oil, and they don't need mixing. They're just a single bottle, just like you see here on this slide. These ones have a little bit longer shelf life. It's not a 2-hour minimum rule. They're killed, right? So as long as you haven't contaminated the inside of the bottle with anything besides a sterile needle, and you need to use that product again tomorrow, or maybe in just a couple days, if you store it correctly in the refrigerator and it hasn't been contaminated, you can use it a little bit longer after initial use. But the product is killed, and so there are some other things, I'll show you in a second, some adjuvants added that can be a little bit challenging in terms of local reactions when you give those vaccines. You never want to vigorously shake or expose those to direct sunlight either. Temperatures outside the range on the label. And like I said, don't freeze them, especially on killed vaccines. Dangerous, deadly toxins can form. The oil-based, right, once they freeze, they break down, they create endotoxins, they layer in that bottle, and then you could potentially draw up a whole dose of an endotoxin that could be lethal when injected. So if it's frozen, or if it's slushy, or if you think that the power went out on a freezing cold night in your medicine fridge, didn't keep it insulated enough, toss those and start over from a safety perspective for the cattle. The other thing that's really important to keep in mind, I always encourage everyone, require is probably a better word. You must read the product label. There's a label for a reason, right, on every single product, but particularly on vaccines, really look closely for when to booster these vaccines. So a booster is like an additional dose of a vaccine needed periodically to boost the immune system. So for example, in human medicine, it's suggested that you get a tetanus diphtheria vaccine in adults every 10 years. You should just always booster that shot so that your body recognizes that disease and maintains immunity. In cattle, booster as the label recommends. So in this triangle 10 HB, you can see in yellow on the label, it says repeat within 14 to 28 days after that initial 5 ml dose. And then it says, additionally, a 5 ml booster dose is recommended annually prior to time of stress or exposure. Why prior to time of stress or exposure? If your system is stressed, if you are stressed, what happens to your immune function? It goes down, right? So always try to do this when we're not stressing cattle out. You probably should not vaccinate your calves right before you put them on the trailer to wean them, okay? So keep that in mind. Boosters are key. In general, nearly all vaccines need a second dose 2 to 4 weeks after the initial vaccination. The problem is that if you just give one, it's not going to create full immunity. You're going to have a brief uptick in resistance to that disease. So if by chance they're exposed to that disease within that first 2 to 4 weeks, yeah, maybe you'll have a good response. But if you only do one dose and you don't do the 2 to 4 weeks later that the label indicates, and 6 months down the road they're exposed to that pathogen, you're probably not going to have a good response. So remember, you always need to read the label and ensure you booster it appropriately. The other thing to consider is these adjuvants. The adjuvants are substances added to some vaccines that assist with creating a stronger immune response. A lot of times, like in human medicine, more adjuvant is added to vaccine for young people or old people or immunocompromised folks. A lot of times, there'll be more, adjuvants added to maybe your killed vaccines because you need the body to recognize and create the stronger immune response to the pathogen since it's no longer living. So because the adjuvants are added, you might see more pain or swelling or redness right at the injection site. So like a tetanus shot, right? You feel more pain or redness or swelling. Same goes for cattle. So in the neck where you're going to give it, you might see more pain or swelling than those that are non-adjuvated. Sometimes you'll also see more systemic reactions in these as well. So you might see cattle that just look pretty dumpy, for lack of better terms. They just don't look like they feel good. They're depressed, their ears are down, their eyes are sunken after vaccination, even though they were healthy a couple days before, and that could be due to adjuvants. They help those vaccines use less antigen, and the antigen is essentially what's in there, the substance that triggers the immune response or that the immune system recognizes. So it requires less actual antigen in there, which is sometimes maybe costly or hard to get your hands on. Sometimes they're aluminum based. And so just important to note, because if you do vaccinate and then you say, well, they all seem like they're sick. It's not because they're sick because of the vaccine. It's sick because of the adjuvant or the vaccine response makes them not feel great for a couple of days. So keep those in mind. These are the common types of reactions. I just talked about these on that last slide due to adjuvants, but pain, swelling, redness at the vaccine site are all common local reactions. Fever, chills, aches, pain are systemic reactions. But then one thing to really note is just like in humans, cattle can have anaphylactic responses to vaccines. So it's a really good idea to keep epinephrine on hand at the squeeze chute if you do see that anaphylaxis happening. All right, so quickly, vaccine handling. I've talked about this stuff already, but if we want to make sure that the vaccines work correctly, we need to handle them appropriately. We need to make sure we purchase them from a reputable source. We only need to purchase the amount that we need. Always check your expiration dates on your vaccine. Don't use outdated drugs. If they're modified live, I already talked about this, use within about an hour of mixing, and always be aware of how you're storing your vaccines, whether it's in a medicine fridge or chute side. You want to try to maintain that temperature between 35 and 45 degrees. The dash of your pickup's not a good place to store your vaccine or your vaccine syringes. Even though it's 39 degrees outside, the greenhouse effect happens, and then whatever on your dash might be up to 95 degrees. So that's not a good storage area. The rusty old fridge that you inherited from grandma and grandpa that they had for, 40 years maybe isn't the best vaccine fridge. So make sure you keep a temperature in there, a temperature thermometer in there if you're going to use that as vaccine storage. And always keep your vaccine fridge in an insulated building, because if it's in an uninsulated shop, it's probably not going to keep the cold vaccine the right temperature when it's super cold out. Might keep it chilled when it's hot out, but probably won't keep it from freezing when it's cold. Like I mentioned, keep vaccines safe. Chute side, use some sort of container to avoid sunlight and freezing. Keep your ice packs in there so that both the bottles that you're drawing from and the barrels of your vaccine gun are protected from UV light and extra heat. And let's talk about different types of vaccine guns, right? So the one on the top here, this All-Flex gun, is a very common type. It actually has an amber coating on the barrel, so it's going to keep that UV light away from what's directly in the barrel, which are the next doses that are going into the animal. A lot of folks like these middle two. They can be useful, but the challenge is that you've got the bottle attached to the vaccine gun. So from a human safety perspective, it's cumbersome. If you don't have great restraint on your cattle, you could have some injuries to your hands. And also the entire bottle is potentially exposed to those elements because it's right there on the vaccine gun. So you need to have some sort of system where you can put that vaccine gun down and it be covered and out of sunlight and out of heat and cold in a way that it's easy to access. The same goes for these gravity feed kinds that you kind of attach to the bottle, hang that from your squeeze chute, and then you have a gravity feed coming down. The bottle may or may not be exposed to the elements. A lot of these companies now have like drink koozies that you put your vaccine in and hang it up there. Challenges with that, you don't actually see the vaccine as you're using it, so you want to make sure that you continually have vaccine flow through the tube. This tube specifically looks like it is coated with something, but many of our vaccine gravity feed tubes aren't coated. And so then, those next rounds coming right into the vaccine, into the animal, maybe have been exposed to UV light or out of the right temperature range. And then, of course, the bottom one, that disposable syringe. BQA says use disposable needles and syringes where practical. Not always practical, but know that it is an option, especially if you have one or two maybe sick, but maybe not those that need to be vaccinated. The other thing to remember is try to keep each of your vaccine guns dedicated for that specific purpose. So you're not going to use one vaccine gun for antibiotics one day and then go ahead and use that same vaccine gun for vaccinations the next time. We don't want that cross-contamination of those different products. Label your syringes when you're using them. So you might be vaccinating for a couple different things. Make sure you know which syringe goes to which vaccine so that you don't cross over on those. And then always change your needle before refilling a syringe, because if you put a needle into the vaccine bottle that has already been in an animal or been exposed to the elements, you have contaminated your vaccine and might render it useless and won't work. So some effects from mishandling vaccines, some adverse reactions. I already talked about this, but if you freeze them and then you thaw them on modified live specifically, you're going to decrease how they work, how effective they are. Some of those that have been frozen will be completely dead, and so you won't have as many actual live pathogens. It can also increase those endotoxin releases. Like I mentioned, you could have a potentially lethal dose come up because you released endotoxins due to the freezing of those oil-based compounds on killed vaccines or gram-negative bacterians. And then adjuvant compounds can also be created just from freezing and thawing and become toxic on killed. Also, as I mentioned, vigorous mixing can be an issue. So once you reconstitute, that swirling or like slowly mixing is the best practice because it can break cells in your modified lives. And when you break those cells, you release endotoxins that can be potentially fatal. I have a video on here, another video that we can share the link to. This is Dr. D. Griffin. He is one of the founders, I think forefathers, I would say, of beef quality assurance. And he gives a little demonstration here of cleaning your vaccine guns and how important it is to make sure that you sterilize particularly the inside of the barrel of many of your vaccine guns. But if you have the gravity feed ones like he's holding there, he's got a really cool microwavable method. Even though there's metal within those components, you can actually successfully microwave them to create the boiling and the heat sterilization response. So we can share that video, but I know I only have a few more minutes left here to get through this stuff. But essentially, heat sterilization is key. If you've got these traditional vaccine guns, you do have to use some oil on those rings. So just cooking oil, which is usually soybean oil or vegetable oil on the rings, will make sure that they continue to work appropriately. Do not contaminate your vaccine guns with disinfectants, because if you're using modified live product, a disinfectant will kill the pathogen that you're trying to have alive to inject in the animal to replicate. So don't use rubbing alcohol, don't use chlorhexidine, anything that's a disinfectant, keep out of the barrel of your gun and just heat sterilize. Boil a cup of water for 3 minutes, suck it up in that vaccine gun and squirt it back out. And then you can store your vaccine guns very similarly to how you would store your vaccines. And then if you keep them all in the refrigerator together, then you're pulling them out at the same temperature and you don't have temperature fluctuations from the time you draw the vaccine up into a barrel of a vaccine gun that was sitting on your dash of your truck, right? So keep those things in mind. And I would also be remiss not to mention the importance of administering your vaccines in the correct location for safety and for them to work appropriately. So hopefully many of you are familiar with the BQA injection triangle in the neck. I know from a safety perspective, some of you dairy producers don't have good restraint or access to the neck, but it is a BQA guideline to put all your injections in front of the shoulder where we have lower quality cuts of meat. Also, from a safety perspective, dispose of your needles correctly. You need to use a sharps container, and it could be as simple as these thicker plastic, writing on them contain sharps and taping them off and disposing of them at the local landfill. But it also could be that you use a biohazard sharps container and you have someone that you contract with that comes and picks up your needles and disposes of them appropriately. Always remember to dispose of them according to EPA guidelines for sharps. There are some places in our state that will take a coffee can duct taped off that says contain sharps and take it to the landfill. There's other counties that will not, so just make sure that you're aware of it. But bottom line is, don't store your sharps like this. This is going to increase the risk of human safety hazards. Looks like they tried to store it correctly in a sharps container. They left it outside, it dry rotted, it fell off the bench, and then we had some issues with how we were going to clean that up. So let's just go for the last 5 minutes into human safety considerations, right? On that note of having sharps out. All of our products are required by the Code of Federal Regulations through the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, under viruses and serums, labeling, yada, yada, that all these products must have on their label, in case of human exposure, contact a physician. Now, one of the challenges with that is there's no specific antidotes on the label unless anaphylaxis reaction, and it'll say keep epinephrine on site. And there may be additional information on a safety data sheet if it does exist. So for the brucella vaccine, maybe not required, but there will be additional safety information, but may not specifically be on the label. So human health risks with animal vaccines. Maybe some of this stuff is underreported, but one of the biggest risks we see is needle sticks. They're common. How frequent are they? How well reported are they? We do have some data from the veterinary side of things that show that 93% of veterinary nurses at least had one needle stick over their career. Some other risks would be breathing in intranasal vaccines, humans actually inhaling those, and any kind of like spray back into your eyes or wounds with vaccines. But to get a little bit more specific on needle sticks, this is a needle stick injury comparison across sectors, comparing cattle health to, or not cattle, but animal health, veterinary health or care to human health care. And you can see that percentage there is what, like almost 75% of needle sticks reported in this data came from animal situations, veterinary care and or animal research. Maybe healthcare is underreported, but I'm kind of doubting that because of the regulatory oversight there. But emergencies are at 22% and regular healthcare is at 5%. So those of us in this industry are exposed regularly to needles and likely have have more higher risk of needle sticks than others. So there's really, besides needle sticks or within needle sticks, there's a couple areas that we want to make sure that we're aware of when it comes to human health risks with animal vaccines. Number one is there are certain vaccines that actually can cause diseases in humans that we should be aware of. So here's some examples. Brucellosis. That is why we have to have veterinary oversight when we bangs vaccinate our heifers. The modified live rabies vaccines could potentially cause rabies if mishandled, and anthrax. So big, scary ones that are zoonotic diseases, those vaccines can also create huge disease risks. Then we also have a category of anaphylaxis or allergic reactions to modified live vaccines in humans. And then we also have adverse reactions due to inflammation, but maybe not the actual disease. And those can be based on the adjuvants or the oil-based vaccines. So specifically from an adjuvant perspective, we have got some examples that we've seen in human health where we have seen severe inflammation, necrosis of human tissue, and even amputation when administering or accidental exposure to certain types of vaccines that have killed vaccines that have adjuvants. One of those examples is the scour boss. We've got reports of a dairy worker having a localized reaction. They needed emergency room care. But you can see on like scour boss here, it does have the in case of human exposure, contact a physician. It does say anaphylactic reactions may occur, so treat with epinephrine, but it really doesn't list these other issues that we've seen happen with human health. On the other side of things, those killed vaccines based on oil, the fact that they're oil-based, we've noted, or there's been research showing granuloma formation, sterile abscesses, and surgical debridement required for people that have accidentally had exposure to those. We've also had adverse tissue reactions to mineral oil containing vaccines. Johne's vaccine, which we don't have a Johne's vaccine here in the US according to USDA, or Newcastle vaccine in poultry. They actually do have an injectable one in day-old chicks, which is that bottle on there that will cause necrosis in the tips of the fingers of those people giving the injections, which I can imagine in a tiny chick, you might be likely to poke your fingers. So PPE is very important when administering vaccines. These are a list of products that require heightened safe handling procedures. Only a couple of them are specifically vaccines, but there are many products out there that we need to be extra careful when using on our livestock. It's not an all-inclusive list. When in doubt, read the label, but just some quick tips on avoiding needle sticks. Limit your exposure. All sharp objects should be kept on a flat, stable surface, not in your pocket, not in your bibs, not in your teeth. Keep a direct, uninterrupted line between you and the cooler or vet box and the squeeze chute where you're delivering that administering that product. Use your sharps containers. Replace your needles frequently to avoid unnecessary force. If you're trying to push in too hard because your needles became dull, you're likely to hurt yourself. All your employees should have a tetanus vaccination, a current tetanus vaccination. Animals should be properly restrained. Always keep instructions near the chute in the event of an emergency. So know 911, know the number to the ER or urgent care. And also, if you do stick yourself and have accidental exposure, a very good number to call is Rocky Mountain Poison and Drug Safety, and they can help you out. The other thing to keep in mind is that all of your vaccines, most manufacturers will have a registered nurse or nurse practitioner on call. If you do have accidental exposure, you can call the vaccine manufacturer and they can help you out. But really, the bottom line, right, in this discussion is proper restraint is key. Hopefully none of you are using squeeze chutes that look like these medieval torture devices, right? Most of our squeeze chutes have appropriate neck access right now, appropriate restraint, and can help keep people safe. But proper restraint is key, and proper PPE is of utmost importance as well.